Just after midnight on the 11th of July, 1881, the crew of HMS Bacante spotted a ship glowing red through heavy fog off the southern routes below Africa. The vessel crossed directly against the wind. It had no signal lamps burning. It had no visible naval escort. It offered no response to standard identification calls. A Royal Navy officer recorded the sighting carefully in the ship's official log, along with the names of 13 witnesses who saw the exact same thing standing on the exact same deck at the exact same time. The officer who wrote the entry was a 14-year-old midshipman named Prince George of Wales, the boy who would eventually be crowned King George V. While those diaries were later compiled and prepared for publication by his tutor, Reverend John Neil Dalton, the core of the entry remained startlingly clinical. Neither the prince nor his commanding superiors described the midnight sighting as a maritime superstition or a trick of the exhausted mind. It was logged exactly the way Royal Navy officers logged impending storms, collisions, equipment failures, and deaths. Position, weather, time, witnesses. Then he signed his name beneath it. Drop a comment and tell us whether you think highly trained naval officers could misidentify something this badly in open water, and subscribe if you want the dark, untold stories hidden inside real historical records. Because this particular story was written in ink into official government logs long before it became a popular legend. To understand why that specific sighting mattered and why it caused such quiet discomfort within the British Admiralty, you have to understand what the Royal Navy represented in 1881. Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface, an empire built entirely on the back of global shipping. The entire system depended on officers who could observe accurately under extreme, life-threatening pressure. These were not casual sailors. These were men trained from early adolescence to measure distance by eye, track shifting weather patterns, identify enemy or allied ships simply by the black silhouette of their rigging against the night sky, and record this information with absolute precision. Mistakes at sea killed people very quickly. A false report could end a decades-long career. A captain who exaggerated sea conditions to justify a delay risked a severe court-martial. Prince George and his older brother Albert Victor were receiving this exact rigorous training aboard a ship that displaced more than 4,000 tons. The Bacante carried a crew hardened by years of unforgiving sea duty. These men were not frightened passengers hearing ghost stories in a dimly lit port tavern. They had crossed tempests in the Atlantic and typhoons in the Pacific. They knew the difference between a cloud bank, a distant lighthouse, and a ship. They knew exactly what ordinary physical vessels looked like in heavy fog. This is exactly why the Bacante report became so exceptionally difficult to dismiss. But the strange part of the legend was not simply the sighting itself, it was the geography of where it happened. The violent waters surrounding the Cape of Good Hope had a blood-soaked reputation centuries before the Flying Dutchman ever entered maritime folklore. When Portuguese explorers first mapped the region, they originally called it the Cape of Storms, and for a very terrifying geographical reason. It is the exact point where the freezing waters of the South Atlantic Ocean collide head-on with the warm Agulhas current of the Indian Ocean. They smash together with enough sheer force to tear heavy wooden ships apart at the seams. Waves routinely climbed above 40 feet during winter pressure systems. The winds could reach hurricane strength without warning, and they stayed there for days, pinning ships against hostile coastlines. In the 17th century, a top-heavy vessel caught broadside in Cape waters could capsize and vanish into the black water before nearby ships had time to even unlash their rescue boats. Yet, despite the graveyard of timber resting on the seafloor, every major European empire sailing east toward the riches of Asia had to pass directly through it. By the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company, known historically as the VOC, operated the largest, most aggressive commercial shipping network on Earth. It was the first true megacorporation. Hundreds of heavily armed merchant vessels moved between Amsterdam and Batavia, their holds packed with silver, raw silk, tea, rare spices like nutmeg and cloves, fine porcelain, and military supplies. These cargoes were worth absolute fortunes. A single successful voyage could return profits exceeding 200% to the investors back home. In this hyper-capitalist system, the company treated global trade like a ruthless mathematical equation. Every rope, every brass cannon, every barrel of salted pork, and every human sailor had a strict recorded value attached to it. Delay meant massive financial disaster. The VOC heavily rewarded their captains for speed, punished them for hesitation, and expected them to maintain rigid delivery schedules even during the deadliest storm seasons, which is why the disappearance of one specific highly valued ship became impossible for the company to ignore. Most surviving versions of the legend trace back to a Dutch company captain named Hendrik van der Decken. The surviving documentation around him is fragmented, scattered across centuries of archive fires and lost manifests, but enough remains to establish his profile. He was an experienced, hardened company captain, trusted with navigating the fastest routes through the most dangerous waters. He had a fierce reputation for forcing passage when slower, more cautious captains chose to delay. In the spring of 1680, his vessel departed Amsterdam heavy with cargo, pointing its bow toward the East Indies. The long voyage progressed normally until the ship reached the southern African routes, arriving right at the peak of storm season. While other captains dropped anchor in sheltered bays, choosing to wait for calmer weather near the Cape Colony, Van der Decken refused to wait. Cape delays could destroy an entire trading cycle. If a ship missed the narrow seasonal windows of the Indian Ocean monsoon winds, it could remain trapped at the bottom of Africa for months. Food would rot in the hold. Scurvy and dysentery would spread through the tightly packed crew decks. Van der Decken knew that company officials in Amsterdam pressured their commanders constantly to maintain pace, regardless of the human cost. Driven by the promise of profit and the fear of failure, he sailed directly into the maelstrom. Witnesses aboard other vessels near the Cape later described a weather system severe enough to snap thick wooden masts like twigs and rip canvas sails directly from their rigging lines. One chilling account from a nearby merchant vessel described seeing Van der Decken's lanterns moving violently through the black water, pushing forward long after other ships had retreated to the safety of the open sea. Another captain reported seeing waves breaking across the Dutch ship's deck so heavily that the vessel seemed to completely vanish between the massive swells. And then the glowing lanterns disappeared entirely. No survivors ever reached the shore. No confirmed wreckage or cargo washed up on the beaches. The Dutch East India Company eventually updated their ledgers, writing the vessel off as lost with all hands aboard. Around 150 sailors vanished somewhere south of Africa, swallowed by the deep. But 3 months later, the story took a darker turn. Another Dutch merchant captain arrived in port and quietly reported seeing a heavily damaged vessel moving against the wind near the exact same routes where Van der Decken's ship had disappeared. The report described torn sails hanging from splintered rigging that should not have remained standing in open water. The ship refused all signal contact. As the silent vessel passed through a break in the fog, several terrified crew members claimed they recognized the specific hull design and figurehead of the lost Dutch ship. The company executives did not publicly circulate this report. They depended entirely on investor confidence, and news that their captains were encountering phantom ships in the exact waters where multi-million-dollar trade convoys were vanishing would have skyrocketed insurance rates. It would have terrified crews who were already deeply reluctant to sail the Cape routes during the winter months. Internal company correspondence from the late 17th century shows repeated, anxious concern over rumor control among their sailors. But sailors carried stories across oceans much faster than governments could contain them. By the early 1700s, taverns and shipyards from Rotterdam to Portsmouth echoed with nearly identical accounts of a ghost ship appearing just before violent storms broke. Witnesses consistently described an old 17th century Dutch-style vessel moving unnaturally against prevailing winds. Some claimed the rotting ship glowed faintly red at night, while others reported seeing a silent skeletal crew standing completely motionless near the rails. And eventually, it wasn't just tavern gossip. The Royal Navy started recording the sightings too. In 1835, officers aboard HMS Eurydice formally documented an unidentified vessel near the Cape routes. The ship was maintaining impossible speed directly against hostile headwinds before disappearing completely into a fog bank without changing its heading. In 1840, a highly respected British merchant captain named Edward Mansfield filed sworn testimony describing an old Dutch-style ship appearing suddenly through a thick fog, sailing dangerously close to his own vessel before vanishing into thin air minutes later. Similar highly detailed reports surfaced from French, German, and Dutch naval crews throughout the entire 19th century. This sheer repetition gave the legend weight. Sailors are inherently practical people. A crew surviving 6 months at sea does not remain functional by jumping at shadows or believing every superstition. But patterns matter aboard ships because repeated mistakes become fatal. If enough experienced veteran captains warned about strange optical anomalies before storms, younger officers listened. By the late 19th century, Flying Dutchman stories had become embedded so deeply inside maritime life that some crews actively treated the sightings as practical weather omens. British sailors crossing southern routes occasionally altered course immediately after reports of phantom vessels, bracing for incoming hurricanes. The Royal Navy despised this contradiction. Discipline aboard British warships depended on absolute, unquestioning control, and supernatural superstitions complicated that system. Yet, their own official logs kept preserving the sightings. Just 4 hours after Prince George spotted the glowing ship from the deck of the Bacchante, the lookout who had first reported the eerie red light fell from the high rigging to his death on the deck below. The fatal incident was entered into the log right beneath the ghost ship sighting, recorded with cold, unfeeling precision. No ghost story embellishment, just facts. So, what exactly were all these highly trained naval crews seeing in those treacherous waters? By the early 20th century, maritime investigators and scientists attempted to strip away the folklore and solve the Flying Dutchman mystery through physics, oceanography, and physical evidence. The waters near the Cape of Good Hope operate on violent, complex mechanics that create bizarre optical illusions under very specific atmospheric conditions, especially during heavy temperature inversions, where cold air sits trapped right above the freezing ocean surface, while warmer air acts as a lid above it. Distant ships can appear wildly distorted. This phenomenon is known as fata morgana. The layers of different air temperatures actually bend light rays, acting like a giant atmospheric magnifying glass. Vessels that are miles beyond the physical horizon can suddenly appear to be floating just ahead. They may seem suspended above the water, stretched vertically into massive shapes, or appear to be moving unnaturally against the visible wind direction. When you pair a fata morgana mirage with violent electrical storm effects like St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon that coats wooden ship masts and metal rigging in a buzzing, eerie blue or red plasma glow, even the most grounded witnesses might genuinely believe they are watching a supernatural event. But researchers proposed another, far more disturbing possibility. Salvage teams and marine archaeologists exploring the vast wreck fields near the Cape have recovered brass cannons, iron cargo chests, and massive ship timbers preserved perfectly beneath the freezing water. More than 3,000 documented shipwrecks now rest along those southern African routes. Under rare, extreme weather conditions, the violent underwater currents can actually force partially submerged wreckage to temporarily break the surface. Trapped air pockets or shifting ballast can cause the skeletal remains of a centuries-old galleon to rise through the fog, battered and broken, floating just long enough to be spotted by a passing ship before the ocean drags it back down to the dark. If this horrifying theory is true, it perfectly explains why so many historical reports described archaic ships appearing briefly before vanishing completely. It also introduces a grim reality the Royal Navy never liked discussing. Sailors were not simply seeing a ghost story pass between frightened crews. They were watching a physical graveyard surfacing in front of them. Even as modern technology advanced, stripping away parts of the mystery that had terrified earlier generations of sailors, the stories refused to die. The invention of radar, aircraft patrols, and satellite forecasting reduced the sheer volume of shipwrecks, but the ocean below Africa still behaved like a place capable of creating impossible stories. In 1942, during the height of the Second World War, Allied merchant convoys passing below southern Africa reported strange visual contacts during strict blackout conditions. While German U-boats hunted them in the dark, tense sailors described unidentified vessels with old-style rigging appearing briefly outside their convoy formations. The ships would sail silently alongside them, completely unresponsive to signal lamps, before disappearing into the black ocean. Wartime commanders usually blamed these sightings on the extreme exhaustion, stress, and sleep deprivation of the crews. But the details matched the Flying Dutchman legend perfectly. The story endured for centuries because the legend attached itself to a real historical wound that never fully healed. The Dutch East India Company eventually collapsed entirely, crushed beneath the weight of its own corruption, massive military overspending, and catastrophic debt. But before it fell, it consumed enormous numbers of human lives. Thousands of sailors died from storms, brutal shipwrecks, scurvy, and forced labor conditions. Most of these men disappeared anonymously into corporate ledgers that treated human deaths as mere operational losses, the cost of doing business. The Flying Dutchman transformed that brutal, uncaring machinery into a single, haunting image people could actually remember. A captain pushing through impossible weather because turning back threatened profit. A crew trapped below him in the dark with no authority to refuse a suicidal order. A ship disappearing into waters already crowded with the wreckage of previous failures, then returning again and again before storms, as though the cursed voyage had never ended. Empires built on maritime trade demanded speed above all else. Faster voyages, faster routes, faster cargo delivery. Wealthy investors sitting in comfortable mansions in Amsterdam and London rarely saw the monstrous storms their captains crossed or the bodies of young sailors buried at sea. They saw ledgers, timetables, and profit margins. Men like von der Decken existed because the global trade systems heavily rewarded captains who were willing to gamble human lives against the weather. Modern researchers still divide sharply over what these historical witnesses actually saw. Whether it was the optical trickery of a Fata Morgana mirage, the terrifying reality of a 60-foot rogue wave, or the surfacing dead of a 300-year-old shipwreck, none of those explanations fully erased the central problem. Credible, serious witnesses kept writing it down. A Royal Navy prince saw it, and his command signed off on the official report, knowing future historians would eventually read it. Veteran merchant captains risked their careers, their livelihoods, and their reputations by filing similar accounts. Naval officers preserved records they could have easily ripped from the logbooks and thrown into the sea. For 3 centuries, the Flying Dutchman occupied that strange space between documented reality and unresolved mystery. Not because uneducated people desperately wanted to believe in ghosts, but because far too many serious witnesses decided that what they saw in the dark was worth recording anyway. Tell us in the comments which part of this dark history stayed with you the longest. Usually the details that stick in our minds are the exact ones that history tried hardest to sink beneath the water.